Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, joined today by a couple of my good friends, Alfredo Brown, Dave Kluge. Guys, thank you so much for being here today. It is the most wonderful time of the year for Dynasty Fantasy Football managers. Next week, we get free agency. We just had the combine. The draft is on the way. Thanks for being here. Alfredo, I want to start with you, because one of the reasons I wanted to have you guys on was that you guys released the Footballguys rookie draft guide. I've really been enjoying going through it. It is robust. There are names in there you're not going to, you guys go deep. And I wanted to give you guys right at the top, Alfredo, you can just give us a little pitch on the Footballguys draft guide.
Yeah, the Footballguys draft guide is awesome. I mean, we've gone well over 140 prospects in this. We're adding more and more prospects as players that maybe not everyone has heard of. We're invited to the combine, and we're adding their relative athletic scores. We're adding all of their stats. We're getting pretty good size scouting reports in there as well. And then we have a lot of these cool badges that kind of give you an indicator of what these players are really good at, what they might struggle at, their player comps, their draft round projections, all kinds of stuff. And then we take that a step further and just tie it to fantasy football and give you the rankings for that as well. And it's one of the few draft guides that's not just one person, it's a collective group of all of us. So you get a whole bunch of different opinions on that. Like, honestly, Dave and I disagree on a lot of things, but that's what makes this guide awesome, is we get to a consensus in it. So it's a lot of fun. You can check it out, footballguys.com/rookie guide, and we'll have version 2 releasing sometime later next week.
That was a nice promo, Dave. I'll give you a chance at the end of the show to top that. But
Wednesday, by the way, you say next week, Alfredo. Wednesday, we're locked.
There we go. I didn't know.
Version 2 will be out Wednesday morning.
Excellent.
That's just like me to ruin it on the last play of the game.
Yep. Speaking of ruining things, Dave's Bears just stole Joe Thuney, and now they're probably going to go draft Ashton Genty. Dave, I just I want to start things off on a good note with you. How excited are you about Caleb Williams in 2025?
No, I don't sip the offseason excitement anymore, Heath. I've been a Bears fan for a long time, and I know this is always the best time to be a Bears fan is like February and March. We always get the exciting signings and the big free agents and the top coaches. But no, I am at the point now where I need to see it on a field during the regular season before I start sipping any sort of Kool-Aid.
Well, I just don't think there's any chance at all that when an organization like the Chiefs trades away a 32-year-old guard, you should have any concern at all about that guy. I'm sure he's perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with him at all.
I'm actually more excited about Jonah Jackson. That's a guy who I think was just got a tough go last year, with the injuries and being forced to play center. But you look at what Jonah Jackson did when he was in Detroit with Ben Johnson. They were pulling him off the line, using him as a lead blocker. I think that's the guy. And, 4 years younger as well, that Bears fans should be even a little bit more excited about.
There we go. There's a little bit of Bears optimism. Bear down. So on today's show, we will be talking rookies, and more rookies. We're going to do the top 5 rookies at each position. And then we'll also later in the show talk about some of our favorite sleepers in the class. But we always start with 3 questions for our guest. I want you guys both to answer these. I'll let Dave go first on the first one. We'll try to keep the answers pretty short and sweet. So what is your elevator pitch for how you evaluate rookies? And then Alfredo, you can just follow.
I start with the analytics, and then that kind of tells me who I should be looking out for. It's really easy to kind of look through the rushing leaders and the receiving leaders and say, these are the guys that I want to look at. And then I go to the film. I'll be honest. I know a lot of people are going to scoff at this. The first thing I do is look at highlights because I want to see how a player does what he does best. After that, then I'll go through with the film and try to find the warts in the game and the things that they can improve on. But for me, I don't try to get too bogged down to takes at this point in the offseason. I think the draft is really kind of my guiding beacon more than anything else. We know that draft capital is the strongest correlation to career production. So this is the time of year where I want to learn about the strengths and weaknesses of all the players, think about the ideal landing spots, but I do tend to bend my rankings quite a bit post-draft.
Yeah, I'm very similar to Dave, except just a different order of operations. I'm going to watch the film first because I want to go into it with no preconceived notions of who this player is, and then just kind of stick onto, well, the stats said this, and now the film says that. I'm just going to look at the film first, watch that, see how I feel about it. Then I'm going to go back to the analytics, take a look at that, and say, okay, well, this guy didn't seem like he was breaking a lot of tackles, but there's so many missed tackles forced, and there's a lot of yards after a catch on this. there's a lot of big plays that's going to make me go back. And the same thing with the combine. Combine makes you go back to more film. And I think the big thing too is that with each position, you can't simply look at the same thing over and over. With tight ends, you want to look more at athleticism. Can they run after the catch? What's the speed like? Can they line up in the slot? Where can they go? Running backs, I'm big on vision and lateral agility. Wide receivers, for me, spatial awareness is huge. If you don't know where you need to be on the chessboard, you're probably not that great of a wide receiver. So there's different little factors that I'm looking for throughout each of those.
Sometimes the chat has better questions than I do. And so question number 2, we'll start with Alfredo. And I'm going to bend the question a little bit because Ryan asks, could you please name some of the best players worth trading away for Malik Nabers? And so I think like one way you could do this is just say like, who are the players like directly behind Malik Nabers in your dynasty rankings? And you can answer it that way if you want, Alfredo, but I also will add an addendum to this question. Are there any rookies in this class that you would rather have than Malik Nabers?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I think no. As much as I like this class, even at the running back position or tight end position, I just don't think we're finding a guy like Malik Nabers who's having that incredible rookie season in the absolute worst of circumstances. So no, if I have Malik Nabers in Dynasty, I'm holding on to him because this rocket ship's about to take off. Like that's where I'm at with him.
And since I just sprung this question on you guys, I'm going to do the follow-up so Dave doesn't have to do the dynasty guys. But just looking at my rankings and you can tell me, Dave, if this sounds about right. Malik Nabers is my number 3 player in a 1 quarterback league.
I would guess Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson ahead of him.
Exactly. So like the guys right behind him for me are Puka Nacua, CeeDee Lamb, Bijan Robinson, Brock Bowers. I think it's more interesting in a super flex league because there's some quarterbacks I would rather have for him, but he's still a top 10 player. Does that sound about right, Dave?
Yeah, I think once you start looking at quarterbacks, I mean, maybe like if you want to give up on a Jalen Hurts, maybe, that's kind of where I draw the line for Malik Nabers. But Malik Nabers, I mean, you talk about players you'd prefer in this class. There's nobody I'd prefer because Malik Nabers already checked that box. Like he was not only a good prospect, but now we know he's also a good NFL player. And to trade Malik Nabers for anybody in this class, you're hoping that you can strike gold again, which you already did with Malik Nabers. So, players to trade straight up for Malik Nabers. I don't know if there's a huge list there. Like you said, just a top 3 player right now in Dynasty.
So it kind of relates to what my second question was going to be for you guys. And I'll let you go first again, Dave. But this class doesn't have a wide receiver at the top of it. Like I assume all going to be in agreement that Ashton Jeanty is the top position player. And a lot of us would say that Ashton Jeanty is the top player even in Superflex, which is a little bit strange. But I wonder when you look at the running backs in this class, Dave, and it might be a long list, how many of them would have been the 101 or the number 1 running back in last year's class?
That's a tough question because Jonathan Brooks, coming off the ACL, I think a healthy Jonathan Brooks probably would have slotted in as a top 3, maybe a top 4 back in this class. But coming off of the ACL that he had going into his rookie season, I think you can make a reasonable argument that there are 7 running backs that would have been ahead of Jonathan Brooks last year. I think the better answer is probably 5. I am a very big Cam Scatabo an RJ Harvey fan, so I'm going to have them ahead of Jonathan Brooks because of the injury. But I think, however you look at it, I mean, I think at best he'd probably be the RB4 or RB5 in this class.
Dave, I love you. You're too quick to forget. Like, Jonathan Brooks was an awesome prospect coming out last year. The fact that he was almost round 1 with the knee injury, still such a good prospect. I would say it's about 3 players: Jeanty, Omarion Hampton, and I think Travion Henderson has about the same, a similar skill set and the same injury concerns as Jonathan Brooks. So I think it would have evened out about there. But Brooks is a prospect, I think it would have still had ahead of Quinshon Judkins, Caleb Johnson, some of those guys. So yeah, I think he just floats around that running back 3 to 4 range.
And I think Henderson was the kind of clear RB1 before he decided to go back to Ohio State last year. I think a lot of people already had him ahead of Jonathan Brooks, and then he just came out and had another great 2024 season. So I think Travion Henderson is for sure ahead of Brooks, but this is just, it's a deep class. And of course we love these guys now, but if Scatabo and RJ Harvey fall to day 3, it'll be a very different discussion.
There might be 10 backs that would have been RB3 in this class.
Yeah.
So it is a fantastic running back class. Let's take our first break and then we will jump into the top 5 at each position. And we're back. So looking at this, the way we're kind of going to go through it is I will ask Alfredo or Dave for his top 5. We can talk about where we disagree. And we'll start with the quarterback position, Alfredo. I'm not sure if there are 5 quarterbacks that you feel are worthy of being ranked in this class, but let's hear your top 5 quarterbacks in the 2025 class.
Yeah, I'm not in love with him. Cam Ward is number 1 for me. I think just the physical tools are off the charts for him, and he has the most potential out of this class. And I think he's the guy that can take a bad team and make it better. Same way we've seen with a bunch of like Josh Allen types over the years. Shedeur Sanders is kind of the de facto number 2, but his draft value is all over the board from like all the way at number 2 to end of the first round, out of the first round. There's rumors that he's not a first round quarterback. At number 3, I have a surprising guy. I have Tyler Shugg out of Louisville at my quarterback 3. He's another one of these guys that I think is just very toolsy. He's big. He's got the strong arm, more mobility than expected. And he's a longtime starter. It's not quite the bugaboo that it used to be after Bo Nix showed everybody that being in school for a long time isn't necessarily a bad thing anymore. At 4, I've got Jackson Dart out of Ole Miss. And then at 5, I've got Will Howard.
Okay, so that is, I assume, Dave, going to be an area where we have some disagreement after the top 2, because most people's top 2, I see Jackson Dart creep into the top 2 every once in a while, but what would your top 5 be, Dave?
Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders at 1 and 2. I think that going anything outside of there is probably getting a little too cute with it. Seems like Cam Ward is pretty much locked in for a top 3 pick. If Tennessee doesn't take him, somebody might trade up to take him. But Alfredo talked about it. Shedeur Sanders, his draft projection right now is all over the place. We thought this guy was a potential number 1 overall pick. Then they were talking about him, falling behind Cam Ward. Now we're seeing some mocks where he falls into round 2, but I'm still going to bet on Sanders as the number 2. For me, I've got Dart at number 3. Quinn Ewers is the guy that seems to be forgotten in this class often, and I'm still holding him down at RB4. And Tyler Shaw, I've heard it said quite a few different ways. I've got him at QB5, and like Alfredo said, I think the age was the big thing that scared so many people away. But after seeing Penix do well last year and Bo Nix do well, I think people are going to start finally healing from the who was it that the Browns drafted at 28, 29 years old a few years ago, and since then we've been terrified.
Brandon Weeden?
Yes, Brandon Weeden. We've been terrified of drafting older quarterbacks since, but I think that we're going to see this renaissance now, especially when we get these extra years of eligibility because of COVID and things like that. I think that Tyler Shugg will fall in at QB5.
So, yeah, I'm just going to kind of, the name that you didn't put in that top 5, Dave, that Adam Azer's been talking quite a bit, which is probably good for you because Azer's been talking about him quite a bit. But no, sorry, Adam, I love you. You know that. I'm not supposed to make Adam jokes when he's not here. I make lots of Adam jokes when he is here. Jalen Milroe. Because of the potential upside, I think a lot of people might move him into this range or at least have him in this conversation. Do you think that he's just too far away from being an NFL passer to be drafted high enough to be ranked as a top 5 quarterback?
Yeah, I think that's it. We fall in love with these guys, the guys with the mobility and the big arms, and they really fill up the highlight reel, but it's very rare that we see these guys translate to NFL success. Now, I think that there are some really interesting possible landing spots for him. Talked about it yesterday on a player profiler show. Not that I expect it to happen, but he could be one of those guys that's a good developmental project for a team that's drafting late in round 1 that wants to draft him, sit him on the bench for a couple of years, and kind of let him develop. We saw Detroit go that route a couple of years ago with Hendon Hooker. Hasn't really panned out, but maybe they go back to the well with Jalen Milroe here and let him sit behind Jared Goff for a couple of years. I think there is chance for Milroe to develop into a good quarterback, but I just don't think he's got the skill set right now that's going to translate to the NFL.
Alfredo, set an over-under. How many of these quarterbacks start more than 20 games in the NFL?
Oh, yuck. Let's go with 2. I think that if someone's going to draft Shedeur Sanders in the first round, they're going to give him 2 full seasons to get his feet under him. I think Cam Ward's going to have plenty of time, but even Tyler Shugg, my quarterback 3, it's going to be very dependent on where these guys land. Shugg would have to be someone that like sits behind a Matt Stafford for a year or 2 and learns and gets into it. And then even then, it's just the longer these quarterbacks sit, the later they get drafted, the less likely it is that they play that many games.
So I should have told you this, but when I said over under, I was expecting a 0.5 to be in there somewhere. So Dave had to choose. I've been pretty sure if I say over under 2, Dave's going to say that's right on the mark. 2 sounds good to me.
We're pushing that one. Yeah.
Oh, 1.5. I will take the over. 2.5. I mean, it just depends on how much an NFL team likes Jackson Dart, right? Like if they get
only
as
takes one.
excited, if they get as excited about him as some of the Dynasty analysts are, Dave, do you think any of these guys are top 12 quarterbacks in your Dynasty quarterback rankings after the draft?
I think if Cam Ward goes number 1 overall, whether it's Tennessee or if somebody else trades up there, I think we can comfortably put him inside the top 12. I did a study last year on how where you're selected in the draft as a quarterback ties to future production. And as I'm sure you'd imagine, the higher you're drafted, the more likely you are to have good success in the NFL. And that is directly correlated to pick value as well. Like a guy drafted number 1 overall is going to typically have a better season than somebody drafted 2, and they're going to do better than somebody drafted 3 overall, which is why I defer so heavily to draft capital. I don't think we're going to see more than 2 quarterbacks go in round 1, though. And, for these guys in round 2 to pan out at the NFL, it's an outlier. I mean, yeah, we've got Jalen Hurts and Derek Carr and Andy Dalton, but we remember those names because they're really the only ones. So quarterbacks are what drive ratings, and everybody likes talking about quarterbacks. But I think the reality is we're really trying to force people into the QB3 discussion. But it wouldn't surprise me after Sanders goes off the board if we don't see anybody else until round 3 or 4.
I think it's interesting, Alfredo, when you're thinking about ranking these guys in the Dynasty quarterback ranking context, you end up looking at them, comparing them to guys from last year's class. And a guy who didn't get drafted as high as Cam Ward's going to, but performed extremely well as a rookie is a guy like Bo Nix. Do you think you'd rather have Cam Ward or Bo Nix right now in Dynasty?
Oh gosh. Everything in my heart says that the Bo Nix train is going to go off the tracks at some point, and Cam Ward has all the tools. But man, it's so hard to argue with how good that rookie year was and how he did it with just so little weapons really around him. Like the Broncos offense can or should only get better if the running game is more consistent and they have playmaking wide receivers. So, I mean, right now, Bo Nix is valued around quarterback 11. I would probably I'd probably still lean Nix because I think he's going to be in a better ecosystem. If Cam Ward ends up on the Titans or even the Browns, I'm not sure that I love it for him.
No, I think that's a good way to wrap it up. And that tells you something when we're talking about the number 1 pick in this draft and the number 1 quarterback in this draft. And we're comparing him to maybe the 3rd or 4th best quarterback in last year's draft. Tells you a little bit about the quality of the position in the 2025 draft. Let's move over to the running back position, which we've already talked about. One of the deepest and also most top-heavy running back classes in a long time. Ashton Jeanty gets talked about as maybe the best running back prospect since Saquon Barkley. Let's hear your top 5 rookie running backs, Dave.
Ashton Jeanty is the clear 101 for me here. Single quarterback leagues, I prefer him. I think you can make a strong argument for taking Cam Ward first in super flex drafts, but Jeanty's the RB1 here. You look at what he did, just a historic season at Boise State. But Amari Hampton, he's got 4 inches of height and almost 20 pounds on Ashton Jeanty. And we got word from Tony Pauline out of Indianapolis that at the combine, he found out that quite a few teams have Omari Hampton ranked ahead of Ashton Jeanty. Now, I don't personally, but I do think that's noteworthy. You look at what Hampton, the size, he does have that prototypical RB1 size. Kind of reminds me of Jonathan Taylor with the build that he has. Jeanty is a little bit smaller, and you have to start looking at some historic outliers to find guys at his size who have done really well. Of course, Jeanty did it in college, so that's why we expect him to do it in the NFL. But after those 2, that's where I have my first kind of tier break. And then tier 2 is a nice, easy 3 for me. So that rounds out my top 5. In tier 2, I've got Travion Henderson atop that list, Quinton Judkins right behind him. Both of those guys were tough to evaluate at Ohio State because of the pro-style offense they ran there. You watch the games, and you almost get this idea that Quinton Judkins is just kind of this early down plotter, and Travion Henderson is just a 3rd down back, when the reality is they're both 3 down backs who were just kind of forced into these roles in college. Travion Henderson, very underrated as a pass blocker. I think that's going to get him on the field for passing downs, but he could also handle the early down work. Judkins was a guy I had some concerns about in regards to his athleticism, but he answered those questions at the combine with a great performance. And then for me, Caleb Johnson, I think he is the pretty easy guy to slot in as RB5. Also, like Quinton Judkins and like Omarion Hampton, he's got the prototypical RB1 size. Didn't run quite as fast as we wanted to see. in at the combine, and that does raise some of the questions that we had about his tape at Iowa. Are those big plays that he was able to consistently rip off going to translate to the NFL? Maybe not, but he still is such a punishing and decisive runner that I think he could make for a good early down back with some potential third down opportunities as well. So I think the top 5 for me is pretty firm there. And having talked with Alfredo quite a bit, I think that we're going to be pretty close on that top 5.
You'd be correct. It's the exact same top 5.
Yeah.
Good.
G.T. Hampton, Henderson, Judkins, and Caleb Johnson. Yeah.
Good. So I'll start with you then, Alfredo. And why does Football Guys hate Devin Neal?
Okay, I'm actually really glad you brought up Devin Neal, because for a while Devin Neal was my de facto RB6 because he just seemed like the guy. He kind of had the overall package. It was my comp for him was Joe Mixon. It was very similar. And what I don't like about Devin Neal is I don't think he quite knows what kind of running back he is. And hearing him in his interviews compare himself to Alvin Kamara when he shows up to the Senior Bowl weighing 220 pounds. And it's like, no, my guy, you're supposed to be a big bruising running back. But then really on film, he doesn't show that. And then he goes to the combine weighing less at 213 and still runs a pretty average 40. I think it was like a 4.58, nearly 4.6 there. Good, decent time at his size, but I just don't think that he quite knows his identity yet. And for many people, that's fine. You have a well-rounded running back. I just don't think he's dynamic enough to be that well-rounded running back in the NFL, working all 3 downs. I want to see him have a bit more of an identity and understand who he is. I'm either the big guy that's out there crushing skulls, or I'm the really fast guy who's dropping weight and I'm being used in the passing game, because that's what we keep seeing in the NFL is these committee backfields where backs have to fit into roles.
So, Dave, we had a question from the chat, and it's kind of similar to a question we answered earlier, but it's one we thinking of it a different way. From our good friend Joey Wright, everybody loves Joey. Which of these rookies from this year are you taking ahead of Bucky Irving in Dynasty?
I think people are really going to dislike my answer here, because I am very much so of the mindset that if a day 3 back really performs well, that's a guy that you should be trying to trade right now. And with how top heavy this draft is, and we're looking at a lot of these guys as projected round 1, round 2 guys, there are 5 guys, all 5 that we just talked about, that I would comfortably take ahead of Bucky Irving. Once you get past there and you start looking at the Scadaboos and the Neals and the Harveys and the Sampsons, there are some guys that could absolutely climb ahead of Bucky Irving, but until we see it on the NFL field, the 5 guys that we just talked about, my tier 1 and tier 2 guys, are the guys that I'd prefer ahead of Bucky.
I would say that I have the top 3, and we all have the same top 3. I still like Henderson just a little bit more than Hampton, but if Hampton's the first back taken, that's obviously going to have to change. But those top 3 will all be ranked ahead of Bucky for me. And then it's possible maybe there's one more. Alfredo, we heard Dave mention earlier that at the combine there was some talk that maybe Hampton is the first running back drafted. Maybe there's some team that likes Hampton more than Genty. It's maybe kind of a long shot at this point, but just hypothetically, how far ahead of Genty would Hampton have to get drafted for you to have a different RB1 in this class?
I think it would probably have to be about a good 8 to 10 pick gap there.
Okay.
I mean, I think we see this happen all the time with skill positions where they are a little flat, and you might see a guy go 2 or 3 picks ahead of him, and that really shouldn't change a whole lot. That doesn't mean the NFL values that player as a whole that way. It just means one team valued another player a different way. So it would have to be a pretty sizable gap between them for me to just undo everything that we've seen from Ashton Genty for so long.
And I think it's a lot to do with the landing spots too, more than just the pick value when it comes to the running backs. Because if you look at the top half, there are some really good landing spots for running backs, and there are some potential landmines. If a guy lands with Carolina, for instance, we know that he's going to be splitting with Jonathan Brooks down the road. If a guy lands in Chicago, we know that there's probably a pretty clear path to, a 3-down workload. San Francisco, could be the heir apparent for a guy like Christian McCaffrey, or maybe if the Jets take Genty, then we know that he could be in a split backfield with Breece Hall next year. So I think landing spots have a lot to do with these running backs as well. And if it does happen where, maybe New Orleans takes Ashton Genty, and we know that he's going to be splitting touches with Alvin Kamara, and Amarian Hampton lands in Chicago where he's going to be the clear 3-down back, that landing spot alone, even with Genty technically going first, might be enough for me to make that flip in my rankings.
Who is your favorite back, Dave, that wasn't in one of our top 5s? I guess, all of our top fives.
RJ Harvey. I love RJ Harvey. He is just one of those human joystick type of players. I think he still needs to develop a little bit. He doesn't always trust his footwork and his play strength. He does a lot of that big gain hunting where he's trying to swing balls out wide so he can hit the home run. And he hit the home run well in college. And it's frustrating because when he does run through tackles, he's got the footwork and he's got the savviness to be able to do that. But he often relies on his athleticism over his play strength. But I think that with a little bit of coaching and a good landing spot, RJ Harvey's a guy that could really take off in fantasy.
And you, Alfredo?
LaQuint Allen for me. He's a guy, the best receiving back in this class by a mile, led the nation in receptions at the running back position, 100 plus catches over the last 2 years, back-to-back 1,000-yard rushing seasons. He's a really smooth runner. He's got some excellent contact balance despite being a little bit more thin. He's about 205 pounds. And he's got that high cut frame. So not typical of what you see of a running back. He looks almost more like a wide receiver, but I think he's going to be a really fun weapon for teams to use as a secondary back and move all around the field. And he's going to be one of those guys that is out there catching passes, but if the running back ahead of him goes down, he becomes like a 3-down guy that's going to have a lot of fantasy value.
So we're kind of doing a bit of a seesaw here because we started with the quarterbacks that we aren't that excited about. Then we go to the running backs who everybody agrees it's an awesome running back class. And then we come to this complicated wide receiver class. Alfredo, who are your top 5 wide receivers? I'm expecting we get a little bit of disagreement at this position.
Oh, we will, because I am still looking at this strictly on talent versus because this is such it's going to be a very odd thing that we're going to see here. It's a very unique circumstance. So at 1, I've got Travis Hunter still. I think he is the best wide receiver in this class. We just have to find out, is he actually going to be a wide receiver at the NFL level? So I've got Travis Hunter at 1, Ted McMillan at 2, Luther Burden at 3, Matthew Golden at 4, and Emeka Egbuka at 5.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, mine a little bit different. Like you said, this is a really weird class, and like I'm going to give my top 5 here, and there's potentially a guy getting drafted in the first round that isn't inside my top 5. We don't really know how NFL teams are evaluating this tier, which makes it really tough. But I've still got Ted McMillan on top. You look at the size, speed, athleticism combo; it's really hard not to like him. Luther Burden, I know so much ado has been made about the manufactured touches, but I think that the ceiling outcome for Luther Burden is just so good that you can't pass up on him. Emeka Egbuka, a very similar player to Burden, going to play out of the slot, could draw a very high target share. That's alluring to me. Trey Harris is a guy that I've really been holding the torch for. I think that he is just such a polished and NFL ready wide receiver. And then I've got Travis Hunter at wide receiver 5, but I feel like talking about the top guys without throwing Matthew Golden in there, who's now getting first round buzz after a great combine, is really tough. So I want to sneak him in there, but it's just hard to move anybody else outside of the top 5.
So I think that we should definitely spend a minute or two on Matthew Golden, because that was one of the first things I noticed when I opened up the Footballguys draft guide. I think in his consensus rankings, you guys had him at wide receiver 3, and that was before he ran the fastest time at the combine. Dave, you mentioned some of the rumors that came out of the combine, and one of those was that Golden could be the first wide receiver taken in the NFL draft. Does he have a chance to be the first wide receiver taken in rookie drafts?
I think that people are going to defer pretty heavily to NFL draft capital by the time rookie draft season rolls around, and it's impossible to ignore the buzz. But like you said, there's going to be a lot of disagreements here because nobody really knows what's happened. I've heard some people say Ted McMillan is going to be a top 5 pick. Other people have him at the end of round 1. Matthew Golden is a guy who was, a projected day 2 pick who is now looking like he could be the first wide receiver off the board. We've got Travis Hunter, don't really know what to do with him. So I think that people are going to end up defaulting to NFL draft capital. If a team invests a top 10 pick in Matthew Golden and another wide receiver doesn't go off the board inside the top 15, I think that Golden becomes the unanimous wide receiver 1. It really just depends on what NFL teams are going to prefer, because all of these guys have such different profiles as well, which really makes the conversation fun.
Alfredo, I've got Ted McMillan right now as my number 1 wide receiver because I'm factoring in the Travis Hunter risk maybe a little bit more, and we can talk about that in a second. But the one thing that bothers me a little bit about McMillan, you maybe just take this fear away from me, is if I'm looking for the guy when they're all just standing up in the room that looks like the most recent busts at the position, especially in the first round, it's the guy that's 6'5", 212, right? It seems like the smaller guys are the guys who have maybe overperformed our expectations, and the guys that look more like him are the guys who have busted. Do you see any bust risk here?
I mean, it's a horrible cop-out answer, but there is with every single player. I think that if there is going to be a bust potential for Tet McMillan, it's that he's not the best separator, but we said a lot of the exact same things about Drake London coming out of USC, right. And he's a very similar prospect profile here. He's highly productive, target monster, tall guy that uses his wingspan to create a huge catch radius and create separation at the top of his stem. He's not going to be a burner deep, but he is going to be good enough that he can manipulate in his routes to create the separation needed. He just doesn't do it consistently. Being as tall as he is around that height, it's hard for him to change levels. And when I say that, I mean like drop your hips and be able to change directions. So he's not going to be like Luther Burden and Matthew Golden and a bunch of these other really quick guys that are going to be open every single play. He may not look open on every play, but he's going to be able to come down with the contested catches and have the big catch radius. So the possibility of him being a bust, I mean, sure, he ends up going to, let's say, the New Orleans Saints or something like that, and then he's got to compete for targets with Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, and then hope that Derek Carr is going to be accurate and be on a team that's rebuilding for a long time. Yeah, it could absolutely happen that way, but he could also end up in Carolina and be the number one target for Bryce Young and be a guy that's getting, the Mike Evans role in the Dave Canales offense. So like there's a lot of back and forth with Tet. I do think that overall he is a pretty safe prospect with a good floor.
Dave, we heard Alfredo say that he thought that Travis Hunter is the best wide receiver in this class. We just don't know if he's going to play wide receiver. I feel like going into the NFL draft, he has at any position the widest range of potential outcomes. How high, like if he's a full-time corner, then we're not even drafting him in the first 2 rounds. Maybe we draft him in round 3 just as a flyer because you hope that he's going to play wide receiver in the future. How high could you see Hunter drafted, though, if he gets drafted and the team comes out on draft night and says, we see him as a full-time wide receiver?
Yeah, I think if a team comes out and really says that, if it's a team that doesn't have a lot of target competition and they say they draft him to be a wide receiver, I think he probably deserves to go top 5 in rookie drafts. But right now with the uncertainty, I think it makes sense to kind of wait until the top or the middle of round 2 to take Travis Hunter. I'll go back to the adage we've been hearing about fantasy football forever, right? You can't you can't win your fantasy league at the top of your draft, but you can lose it there. And I think that's why people are scared of Travis Hunter, because you could draft a guy who potentially is only getting 8 to 12 offensive snaps per game. And that, offensive workload could vary on a week to week basis. So I think right now there is a lot of risk with Travis Hunter. The unknown has scared people away, but I think that once he gets drafted, probably within the top 5, and you look at all of those teams in the top 5, most of them do have pretty clear paths to being a wide receiver 1 there. I think then we'll warm up on him a little bit, but I think the unknown right now is why he is, deservedly getting pushed down in rookie drafts a bit.
Alfredo, I'm trying to garner support for a movement that I'm starting. I play in some IDP Dynasty leagues as well. I love the IDP format, even if not enough people play it for there to be a lot of content produced about it. But I really want for everybody to agree that if you're in an IDP league, we're going to have a setting that we're counting his cornerback stats. We're counting his wide receiver stats.
Love it.
You get the points for everything, and he's the number 1 pick.
Yeah, I love it.
The
you just make it like baseball
of football.
Yeah.
Well,
that was the player.
I don't know if you guys played fantasy baseball back when that happened, but there was a huge debate and multiple sites choosing different paths, whether you create a hitter Shohei and a pitcher Shohei, or whether you only count, you have to choose whether you start him as a hitter or a pitcher. Like, it was really controversial. And I'd like to get ahead of this controversy and let's just give him all the points for all the things he does.
That's what I think we should do. I think the one other bit of risk in Travis Hunter that I think even post-draft you still might want to keep in the back of your mind, let's just say hypothetically whatever team drafts him, let's say New England takes him at 4 and Vrabel comes out and says that he is going to be our wide receiver 1. Then let's say Vrabel gets fired for whatever reason. There's constantly churn in front offices, and then a new coach comes in and says, we actually want this guy to be cornerback. So even if we do get that wide receiver sticker after the draft, there's no guarantee that he's still going to be a wide receiver 2 or 5 years from now. So I think there's always going to be that little bit of concern with Travis Hunter.
We do have a Travis Hunter question from the chat. Doak says, where does he go in IDP leagues? My league has 4 defensive spots in our starting lineup. That's not very many.
Right.
And if he's only a cornerback, then I'm not really very excited at all. It doesn't really move me because corner is about the least impactful position when it comes to scoring, unless you're just in a league that only counts like sacks, picks, and touchdowns, and then he's going to maybe be more valuable. But if you can get your league to agree that you get points for his receiving production as well, then the answer, Doak, is that he goes number 1 overall. So we're going to take our second break. Then we're going to get to the tight ends. Then we'll get to a couple of sleepers from these guys. And then we do have a little bit of time to answer some of the questions from the chat. So if you have rookie-specific questions, especially if you can kind of dig a little bit deeper, make these guys answer some hard questions. No, I'm just joking. But like, who do you want to know about? Put it in the chat. We'll try to talk to them after the break.
Gives it to Jenkins for the championship. A 16 beats a 1. From sweet to elite to the Final Four.
So I feel like we're finishing on a high note because the mediocre quarterback class, really exciting running back class, really questionable wide receiver class, and then the tight ends, I think we will all agree it looks pretty great for them. Dave told me before the show that he's going to bring some controversy to his top 5 tight end rankings. So let's go ahead and kick it off.
Yeah, my top 5, and again, this is a lot like the wide receivers, where I feel like there is a top 6, but my top 5 is Tyler Warren. I think that he is in a tier of his own. Like I said, I go to the film and I try to find warts in these players' games so I could set myself up for the inevitable disappointment. I couldn't find any in Tyler Warren's game. I mean, he is about as perfect of a prospect as you can come across. I've got Terrence Ferguson as tight end too, and I think a lot of people are going to say that I was overreactive to his good combine. He was my tight end 3 before the combine. I love the after the catch abilities. He averaged 9 yards after the catch per reception last year at Oregon on a huge target sample. That is just a crazy number, and that's what we want to see in fantasy, yards after the catch abilities. At 3, I've got Colston Loveland. At 4, I have Mason Taylor, who was also a big mover for me after the combine. Didn't do the athletic testing, but you just see him and the way he moves alongside his peers. He is just such a fluid athlete. And then at 5, I've got Harold Fannin, who was my tight end 2 pre-combine, but we know there's a strong correlation between athleticism and tight end production. And Harold Fannin not checking those elite athletic measurable boxes at the combine is definitely cause for concern.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of a different tight end grouping here. At 1, I still have Tyler Warren. I think that he's just the modern day Dallas Clark. You can kind of line him up everywhere, and he's going to have that awesome athleticism downfield. At 2, I've got Colston Loveland. This is a player that I think has very similar athleticism to Warren and was just held back so much by that Michigan offense. At 3, I've got Mason Taylor, who is just your prototypical perfect tight end where he can block, he can run, he can do everything. And he's got the NFL pedigree being Jason Taylor's son. I think he's going to be a guy that can easily hop into an NFL starting lineup on day 1. Whoever drafts him is drafting him to play him, not have him in a rotation. Elijah Arroyo is a guy who might not be the best blocker, but he's a heck of an athlete. He was great at the University of Miami last year. I think a lot of people are going to look and say he doesn't have a lot of production throughout his career. That's been for one thing or another, whether it's been injuries or a bad quarterback play at Miami. But we saw how good he's been this year. And at the Senior Bowl, he was absolutely just killing linebackers, safeties, DBs, anyone going up against him. He's a smooth route runner. I love him there. And then at 5, I've got, Dave's shining knight, Terrence Ferguson. So there I am at 5. I don't have Harold Fannin in my top 5. Sorry about that, Dave.
That hurts my feelings quite a bit. And his performance at the combine was, I guess, when I looked at the numbers, Dave, and there were several things from the combine that I kind of felt this way about. Well, that's not really good, but it's not so bad that I have to cross him out, which is exactly how. And so I think it's kind of a Bucky Irving situation in some ways, that we saw an extremely productive player, Harold Fannin, one of the most productive tight end seasons we've ever seen. And then we see disappointing measurements and disappointing performance at the combine. Does it matter more because of the level of competition that he faced in college?
Well, when he did face good offenses, he had some of his best games. Like, it wasn't like he was just beating up on the poor opponents. So, Harold Fannin, I think he's one of the most intriguing players in this draft. And I don't want to overreact too much, but going into the combine, I already did have this really tight. And what I kind of
Mhm.
do with my combine rankings is I'll move guys inside of tiers. So, well, it sounds like it's this huge drop from Harold Fannin that he went from being my tight end 2 to my tight end 5. The reality is my tight end 2 to my tight end 5 are extremely tight. So I moved him to the bottom of that tier, but still like him a lot. You know, he showed up a little bit shorter and weighed less than we expected. And that was kind of the first thing that was disappointing. Then he came out and didn't run the fastest 40, and that was a little disappointing as well. So I'm not sitting here saying that Harold Fannin is now going to tailspin down draft boards and be a day 3 pick, and you shouldn't have, want anything to do with him in Dynasty. It's just that it's already such a good tight end class that when Terrence Ferguson and Mason Taylor really show out at the combine, Colson Loveland was already a guy that I like quite a bit. When Harold Fannin isn't doing quite as well alongside his peers, I have to move him to the bottom of the tier, but I still think that he has every ability to be a very, very good NFL tight end.
Alfredo, you guys both, and basically everyone has Tyler Warren as the top prospect in this class. There's some people that have talked about him maybe as a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. So, of course, being who I am, I'll bring up the lone wart, and that is the fact that he's going to turn 23 years old before he plays a game in the NFL. And he wasn't particularly good in terms of production until he was older than everybody else. Does that bother you?
No, because I mean, from what we see on the film is that it's not like he was running around bullying younger kids and smaller kids. He was doing it from all over the field. He was lining up as a running back and having to go up against linebackers and defensive ends, and he's outrunning safeties and corners. So from a physical standpoint, it's not like it was the senior kid like dunking on all the 8th graders on the JV team here. This was a guy that was still going up against top competition and doing it in a myriad of ways. And so I think for him, a lot of it still is, I would say, is projection of just a guy who's a phenomenal athlete. Do I think he should go in the top 10? No, I know he's very talented. I just don't know that I would take any tight end that's not like a Brock Bowers or a Kyle Pitts or someone like that in the top 10. I think some people might say Tyler Warren is a very similar prospect to those guys. I don't quite see him there. I think he's probably best going maybe 14 to Indy. I could see him going a little bit lower, but yeah, I'm not seeing him as a top 10 guy.
So we're going to get deeper on these rookies, go well past the top 5 once we get more information, once we know more about landing spot, how the draft capital, how the NFL viewed them. But, one of my favorite things is to get people's favorite sleepers before then. So Dave, who is your favorite sleeper that we haven't talked about yet?
I feel like I fall into this trap every single year, and I'm doing it again. When we have these weak classes, I don't like the guys atop the positional lists when we talk about the wide receivers, but there's a lot of guys deeper down that list that I like. And one that just keeps moving higher and higher up my rankings is Jalen Noel out of Iowa State. He is just such a physical player, kind of took a back. Sorry, what was that?
It's Jalen Noel.
Jalen Noel. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Come on, Dave. You got to stay up to date.
Yeah, Jalen Noel out of Iowa State. He kind of took a back seat to Jaden Higgins there, but I see shades of Golden Tate in his game. He's got the contested catch ability. He's got the after the catch ability. He is just a physical player, does a lot out of the slot, which typically bodes well into the NFL, and the ability to draw targets here. Just a player that I seemingly like more and more the more I watch him. I have moved him up quite a bit in my rankings right now, currently holding down the wide receiver 10 spot.
And Alfredo, your favorite sleeper?
Well, he was a sleeper before, and throughout this draft process, he keeps going up and up. But I've got Jack Besh as my wide receiver 6, the wide receiver out of TCU. And I think a lot of people will look at the stats and say, well, he didn't really do it till his final year. But when you go back, he led LSU in receptions as a true freshman with 4 eventual NFL wide receivers in the roster with Malik Nabers, Brian Thomas Jr., Kayshon Boutte, and Trey Palmer all on that roster. And he led the team in receptions. Now, I know these things happen due to circumstance, but we've seen that even later down the line, he's been able to produce. The whole thing was that LSU wanted to turn him into a tight end so that they could try to get as many of their weapons on the field at the same time. And he's one of these guys, he's not that big, but pretty big and thickly built for a receiver, 6'1", 214. He might probably best in the NFL in the slot, but he played over 70% of his snaps out wide at TCU. So he's a guy I think has a little bit of that versatility to move all over the field, really good hands. He only dropped one pass on 96 targets last year. Great ball tracker on shots downfield. You typically see him getting a lot of passes in the intermediate 15 to 20 yards downfield, which is great. And he's awesome at finding open spaces against zone coverage. And so my comp for him was Puka Nacua, and I see a little bit of Chris Godwin as well. He's my wide receiver 6. I think he's a locked and loaded second round pick, surefire starter on day one after that pick. And I think that the Jaguars at 36 or Patriots at 38 are real possibilities for Jack Besh.
Jacksonville was exactly as you were describing him. I was thinking, you know what? If Jacksonville doesn't steal Chris Godwin away, sorry, Joey, then he would be a fantastic fit in that system. We do have a few prospect questions from the chat. One of them we'll start off with a couple of trade questions. And, we're honest with the listeners here, guys. So you can just tell them how you really feel. Michael traded the 103 and a third round pick in 2026 and 6.2. Yeah. So basically a first and a third for DJ Moore and Bryce Young. This is a super flex dynasty league. Traded away the 103 and a 2026 third for DJ Moore and Bryce Young. Was this a good trade as of now?
I think so. Yeah. I think people still haven't really talked about Bryce Young and the bounce back he had late in the year. Alfredo and I, we just did a show a couple days ago talking about dynasty buys, and we talked about Bryce Young as a guy on keep trade cut right now. He's still valued as a QB 20, which is lower than he was after his rookie season when he was QB 19. For whatever reason, the market just hasn't reacted to Bryce Young. What we saw over the second half of the season when he came back from his early season timeout last year was that he was poised and confident and playing really, really good football. And I think the raw numbers don't even show how good he was, because the Carolina Panthers wide receiver core led the league in drops. There were perfect throws that ended up being interceptions because the receivers there in Carolina just weren't doing a good job. So I'm still very optimistic about the future for Bryce Young. I think anytime you can trade an early first to get a guy who is going to be a potential multi-year QB1, that's a good deal.
You're not getting Genty. You're not getting Cam Ward with that pick. I have the 103 pretty close to Bryce Young in Superflex in value, and DJ Moore for a 2026 third is stealing. So that's a good trade. Let's see if Alfredo likes this next one. I'm in a Superflex tight end premium league. I need a running back. I've got 102, hoping Genty falls. He's probably not going to, but maybe he will. But I got offered Derrick Henry and Cooper Kupp for my 107 and 201 in 2025. Would you trade 107 and 201 for these vets?
I think it's really dependent on your team. If you're competing and you think you're going to make a run with Derrick Henry being the guy that's going to help you get there. I don't know that Cooper Kupp is going to be the guy that helps you get there, but if Derrick Henry at running back helps you get there, I could see you doing the 107 for Derrick Henry. Cause I mean, at 7, you're probably looking at a Quinshon Judkins maybe falling to that point, and you're kind of having to value them. Does Quinshon get a 3-down role? So you're kind of mortgaging stuff to see if you can get that championship this year. So it really depends on the roster makeup. If you're not there and you're not a top 2 team in your league, I don't know that Derrick Henry changes too much for you.
I definitely wouldn't do this deal now. Mm-hmm. I need to see, because I do think in a Superflex tight end premium league, I mean, there's a decent chance that 3 of those picks are Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders, and Tyler Warren. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, and then maybe a wide receiver or 2 goes, is there a chance you're getting Travion Henderson at 107? I wouldn't trade him for Derrick Henry and Cooper Kupp combined, much less throwing in the 201 as well. So I would hold. I would hold. I think the nice thing is if you're holding these picks and you're looking at veteran offers over the next month and a half until your rookie draft, or maybe 2 months until your rookie draft, I don't think the 107 is going to get less valuable. I think the closer we get to the rookie draft, the more excited people are going to get about that pick. And so I'm not saying I wouldn't trade it right now, but I'd have to get overwhelmed more than this trade overwhelms me. Kev says, how many running backs will be taken in the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft? Go ahead, Dave.
I currently have 9 running backs projected to go in the first 3 days, or I'm sorry, in the first 3 rounds. So my cutoff is Dylan Sampson. I think he's the last guy that we see go in round 3.
Is that too high, too low, or just right, Alfredo?
That feels just right. I've got 9 guys as well. Devin Neal is my RB9, and I think that he probably goes in late round 3. So I think that's about right. This class has an embarrassment of riches at the running back spot. It's really deep, and normally that would mean that these teams might feel more comfortable just waiting.
Right.
But I think that once that run starts, if you get 2 guys, maybe even 3 going early in the top 40 picks, there could be a run in round 2, and all of a sudden you got 3 more guys going off the board in round 3. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's about 9 running backs.
Somebody's got some sharp people say that there might be all these running backs get pushed because of the depth of the class.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be that GM that's the one at the start of the run. Everyone's going to kind of be comfortable at the back end of the run. So all these guys who are, round 3 projected guys might end up falling to round 4 or 5 because of the depth. It's going to be a very odd
when
draft.
Ginty goes 6 to the Raiders, it's all going to be for naught.
Well, I think that the key point there is any talk about running backs falling because of the depth of the class, I don't think has any impact at all on Ginty, Hampton, or Henderson.
Right.
Of course.
Nobody's going to look at the depth of this class and say, oh, I don't need to take one of those 3 because of the depth of this class. I think it probably doesn't even impact Johnson and Judkins, but it might. But it's not going to. Those first 3 are going to go, I would assume, in the first 40 picks of the draft.
Yeah.
And then we'll see when the run starts on the next tier, and then on the tier after that, in particular, is the one is like once whether people think Neal needs to be RB6 or whoever their RB6 is, like wherever their end of that tier with Johnson and Judkins is. I think that group after that could be negatively impacted.
Mm-hmm.
And we maybe shouldn't be as worried if one of those guys falls to day 3 and just worry about where they go instead of the day they're picked. We have one more question, maybe 2 more. One more, though, for sure, from Steve. He's rebuilding, and he got offered 2 26 firsts for 103. His only QBs are Drake May and Anthony Richardson.
Yeah,
What do you think,
I'm definitely taking the 2 first in 2026. Yeah, I mean, we've already talked quite a bit about how this is a weaker class, and who knows, maybe you get next year's 103.
Yeah, I think definitely if when you say you're rebuilding, you don't think the contending window starts to open up this year. Then it's a much easier equation because you are making yourself significantly worse not taking the best player in this class and just letting somebody else have them. Does it matter at all to you, Alfredo, who owns those 2026 firsts, or is it just we can't really predict how teams are going to do in 2025 anyway?
It matters a little bit. Like I'd be lying if I say I don't factor that in when I'm looking at a trade. The guy who's always at the top of the league offering me his 2 firsts that could be picked, 111 and 112. It does factor in a little bit, but either way, as we go into 2026, when people start to get excited about that class, the value of those picks is going to be massive. And I don't think a lot of people are going to be looking at where it is. They're just going to be saying, oh, that's 2 26 first round picks. So just the value there is incredible. And at your 103, you're probably looking at Ted McMillan, maybe Amari and Hampton. I don't know that either of those guys put you over the top. 2 first round picks, potentially, multiple quarterbacks or whatever it could be. It's just, it's currency, just play with the currency as you want to in your league.
We do have one more question from the chat, Alfredo. Who is your favorite sleeper employee at Footballguys that has been in the chat today for the entire show?
I want to give a big shout out to Julia Bryant, our video editor. She's fantastic. Yeah. Glad that she's been around. No one else. Absolutely nobody else.
Great question, Joey. Thank you for asking it. Thank you, Alfredo and Dave. It was awesome. Every time I have you guys on, enjoy talking to you. I learned something. I think listeners do as well. Dave, tell the people one more time about the Footballguys rookie draft guide.
Yeah, we had version 1 come out the day after the Super Bowl. We're excited to be first to market on that. But now with the Combine, just another piece to the puzzle. We are adding relative athletic scores. We've changed the projected draft capital on some of these guys, doing updated scouting reports as well. That's going to come out on Wednesday morning. Version 2 is also free. We're going to have over 140 prospects in this guide. And then we'll also come out with version 3 after the NFL draft, where we'll have even more changes. But definitely download version 2 so you can see updated rankings, updated scouting reports, Combine measurables, and all that good stuff.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you to everybody who was active in the chat and sending in your questions. Thank you to Thomas for making everything work like it's supposed to. We will talk to you on Tuesday.